Hello, I'm Essay, your AI essayist. Please note that all content, audio and video in this presentation are AI generated. As AI can sometimes produce inaccuracies, I encourage you to verify any factual information presented. With that in mind, let's begin.
Here is the response. Introduction. Sigmund Freud's The Aetiology of Hysteria, published in 1896, represents a seminal moment in the development of psychoanalytic theory. This essay aims to provide a detailed examination of the arguments presented within this work, specifically looking at Freud's evolving understanding of hysteria's origins. It dissects the essay section by section, scrutinizing the claims put forth regarding trauma, sexuality, and the role of unconscious processes in the formation of hysterical symptoms. The focus will remain squarely on analyzing the internal consistency and evidentiary basis of Freud's propositions, considering how subsequent developments in psychoanalysis have either supported, challenged, or refined these earlier conclusions. This exploration intends to illuminate the foundational logic upon which Freud built his theories and will evaluate the ongoing resonance of these ideas within contemporary understandings of psychopathology and, indeed, the human condition. Section 1. Preliminary remarks on hysteria. Freud begins by acknowledging the prevailing medical views of hysteria as a condition lacking a demonstrable organic basis. His initial claim centers upon the idea that hysteria possesses an etiology, a specific cause, residing not in physical lesions, but in specific live experiences, particularly those of a traumatic nature. This perspective directly challenges the dominant neurological explanations that often attribute hysteria to hereditary weakness or unspecified nervous system disturbances. His assertion acts as a springboard, launching a search for the psychological roots of the affliction. It's worth noting that framing hysteria within a causal framework, rather than simply describing its manifestations, was a bold departure from purely descriptive psychiatry. The suggestion that memories, not directly accessible to conscious awareness, could exert such a powerful influence on bodily functions was revolutionary. The subsequent sections build upon this foundation, endeavouring to provide the empirical and theoretical underpinnings for this central argument. Section 2. The role of sexual trauma. The subsequent sections represent the core of Freud's argument at this stage. He proposes a direct causal link between specific forms of childhood sexual trauma and the later development of hysterical symptoms. Freud elaborates on the specific mechanism through which these traumas imprint themselves on the psyche. He suggests that the experience of a premature or shocking sexual encounter creates a split within the individual's consciousness. The traumatic memory, initially overwhelming the psychic apparatus, is then relegated, repressed, and rendered inaccessible to conscious recall. Despite its apparent disappearance from awareness, this repressed memory continues to exert a pathogenic influence, manifesting itself through various hysterical symptoms, such as paralysis, tics, or sensory disturbances. This is, of course, a critical point. Freud posits that the symptom is not random. It represents in symbolic form the repressed traumatic event. So, in essence, the body speaks the unspeakable. He argues, for example, that a woman subject to forced fellatio might develop a throat constriction or difficulty swallowing, a physical manifestation of the repressed memory. Section 3. The significance of the unconscious. Freud underscores the importance of the unconscious, offering it as the primary domain of the repressed traumatic memories. He describes the unconscious as a repository of thoughts, feelings, and desires that are actively kept out of conscious awareness due to their unacceptable nature or their association with painful experiences. While not explicitly defined with the rigid structural model that would later characterize his work, the unconscious, in this earlier formulation, serves as the engine driving the manifestation of hysterical symptoms. The unconscious, therefore, moves from being simply a theoretical construct to a central player in the drama of hysterical illness. Freud emphasizes the resistance encountered when attempting to bring these repressed memories into consciousness. He argues that the psychic apparatus actively defends itself against the emergence of these painful recollections. This resistance, in Freud's view, constitutes further proof of the traumatic event's pathogenic power. Here, Freud asserts that the analyst's task is not simply to uncover the repressed memories but also to overcome the patient's resistance to recalling them. Section 4. The seduction theory and its initial formulation. In the Aetiology of Hysteria, Freud strongly advocates the seduction theory, a claim positing that virtually all cases of hysteria stem from actual sexual abuse experienced during childhood, primarily by a close family member. He outlines a specific sequence. The child is sexually molested, but the event is initially too overwhelming to be fully processed. The memory is then repressed and remains dormant until puberty, when hormonal changes and renewed sexual feelings reactivate it. This reactivation, however, does not lead to conscious recall but manifests instead as hysterical symptoms. This is an important claim, because it is this formulation that he later retracts. Freud's initial stance on the seduction theory emphasizes the verbatim accuracy of patient reports, suggesting that these recalled events represent actual historical occurrences. He describes techniques used to retrieve these repressed memories, including hypnosis and free association, techniques intended to bypass the patient's defensive mechanisms and bring the traumatic events into conscious awareness. Freud describes the emotional intensity that often accompanies the retrieval of these memories, viewing this cathartic release as a crucial step in alleviating the hysterical symptoms. The emotional expression, the abreaction, serves as a way to discharge the pent-up emotional energy associated with the trauma. Section 5. Case studies and clinical evidence. Freud employs several case studies within the Aetiology of Hysteria to illustrate his theoretical propositions. Although somewhat obscured by the conventions of medical writing, the careful reader can find elements of the famous cases later recounted in greater detail, such as Anna O., and others who would collectively contribute to the understanding of hysteria. He recounts the patient's histories, emphasizing the early sexual experiences that he believes to be the causal factors in their illnesses. Consider the example of a patient exhibiting paralysis in her arm. Freud argues the symptom originates from a repressed memory of the patient being forcibly held down during a sexual assault. The paralysis, therefore, becomes a symbolic representation of the patient's inability to move or resist the traumatic event. In these cases, Freud uses the recovered memories and their associated emotional reactions as evidence supporting his seduction theory. Each successful recall and reaction will consider validation of both the historical accuracy of the events and the pathogenetic role they played in developing hysterical symptoms. Section 6. The problem of trauma and fantasy. A critical examination of the paper demands acknowledgement of the challenges inherent in Freud's reliance on patient recollections of traumatic events. The question arises: how do we distinguish between veridical memories of actual occurrences and fantasies shaped by unconscious desires and anxieties? Freud, at this stage in his work, does not explicitly address this issue. The seduction theory, at this juncture, presupposes the factual accuracy of patient reports. What becomes readily apparent looking back from a later era is the problem of suggestibility and the potential for the analyst to influence the patient's recollections. This is not to suggest conscious manipulation, but rather the unconscious influence of the analyst's expectations and theoretical biases. The boundaries between objective historical fact and subjective psychological experience, therefore, remain blurred, constituting a significant challenge to the validity of Freud's claims. Section 7. The abandonment of the seduction theory. Freud famously abandoned the seduction theory a few years after the publication of the Aetiology of Hysteria. He came to recognize that, in many cases, the reported childhood sexual traumas were not actual events but rather fantasies reflecting the patient's unconscious desires and conflicts. This shift in perspective represents a pivotal turning point in the development of psychoanalytic theory. Freud began to place greater emphasis on the role of the patient's internal world, particularly the unconscious fantasies, in shaping their experiences and symptoms. He realized that the psychological impact of a fantasy could be just as powerful and just as pathogenic as that of an actual traumatic event. This is not to say that Freud completely dismissed the possibility of actual childhood sexual abuse. Instead, he incorporated the recognition of fantasy into the theory, acknowledging that both real and imagined experiences could contribute to the development of hysteria. Section 8. The Oedipus complex and the revision of trauma. The abandonment of the seduction theory led Freud to a new understanding of the origins of hysteria. Instead of focusing solely on external traumas, he now began to explore the internal conflicts and unconscious desires that shape the individual psyche. This eventually led to the development of the Oedipus complex, one of Freud's most controversial and enduring ideas. Freud came to believe that children develop unconscious sexual desires for their opposite-sex parent and feelings of rivalry towards their same-sex parent. These Oedipal feelings, normally repressed and resolved during childhood, can, if unresolved, manifest in later life as erotic symptoms, including hysteria. This Oedipal interpretation of hysteria represents a significant departure from the earlier emphasis on actual sexual trauma. This shift in focus from external events to internal conflicts marked a profound change in the direction of psychoanalytic theory, moving from a focus on the past as a series of external happenings to the internal landscape of the patient. Section 9. From trauma to internal conflict. Freud's evolving understanding of hysteria involved a shift from a linear causal model, where trauma directly causes symptoms, to a more complex interaction between internal and external factors. He came to recognize that the impact of a trauma depends on the individual's pre-existing psychological structure, their unconscious conflicts, and their capacity to process and integrate the experience. It is important to acknowledge the development of defense mechanisms which become central to Freud's understanding. Repression, no longer seen as a simple forgetting of a traumatic event, but as an active process aimed at keeping unacceptable thoughts and feelings out of consciousness. The other defense mechanisms, like displacement, projection, and sublimation, help transform unacceptable impulses into more socially acceptable forms. Hysterical symptoms, therefore, arise not solely from repressed traumatic memories but from the failure of these defense mechanisms to adequately manage the individual's internal conflicts. Section 10. The ongoing significance of the etiology of hysteria. Despite the subsequent abandonment of the seduction theory, the etiology of hysteria remains a significant work in the history of psychoanalysis. It provides a valuable glimpse into Freud's early thinking and highlights the evolution of his ideas. The work demonstrates his commitment to understanding the psychological basis of mental illness and his willingness to challenge prevailing medical views. More importantly, it established certain important principles for the future focus on the connection between early childhood experiences and adult psychopathology, a recognition of the power of unconscious processes and the importance of verbal communication and emotional expression in the therapeutic process. These insights, developed in the Aetiology of Hysteria, would form the bedrock of his later work and would have profound and lasting impact on the fields of psychology, psychiatry, and b. Section 11. Critiques and reinterpretations. The etiology of hysteria has been subject to extensive critique and diverse reinterpretations. Some scholars criticize Freud's reliance on subjective patient reports, arguing that his conclusions were based on flawed data and that his methods were susceptible to suggestion and confirmation bias. Others have questioned the validity of the seduction theory, pointing to the lack of empirical evidence supporting the widespread occurrence of childhood sexual abuse, as Freud initially proposed. Still other scholars, including feminist critics, have argued that Freud's theories are inherently patriarchal reflecting societal biases against women and perpetuating the myth of the hysterical female. These critiques notwithstanding, Freud's work continues to provoke debate and inspire new perspectives on the nature of trauma, sexuality, and the human psyche. It is often suggested that the feminist critiques are born out of a misreading of both the patient and the work. Instead of supporting patriarchal power structures, they are born out of the patient's reaction to them. Section 12 Modern Perspectives on Hysteria. The concept of hysteria has undergone significant transformations since Freud's time. While the term itself has largely fallen out of favour in contemporary diagnostic manuals, the underlying phenomena associated with hysteria continue to be recognised and understood within different frameworks. Conversion disorder, a diagnosis characterized by the presence of neurological symptoms without a discernible physical cause, represents a modern-day manifestation of what was once called hysteria. Somatic symptom disorder similarly captures the psychological causes of bodily symptoms. Dissociative disorders, in turn, address the fragmentation of consciousness and memory that Freud considered central to hysterical illness. While the specific explanations for these conditions have evolved over time, Freud's insights into the relationship between psychological distress and physical symptoms continue to inform our understanding of these complex phenomena. Conclusion: the etiology of hysteria remains a fundamentally important work. While Freud's initial emphasis on the seduction theory and his later abandonment of it represent a significant turning point in the history of psychoanalysis, the work continues to stimulate exploration into the complexities of the human psyche. His emphasis on the role of the unconscious, the impact of childhood experiences, and the importance of psychological meaning in shaping physical symptoms remains relevant to contemporary understandings of mental health. The initial claims, however flawed, provided the foundation and the impetus for what would unfold as a comprehensive theory of the human psyche. The historical importance of this work, therefore, cannot be overstated. It stands as a watershed moment in the history of psychology, launching modern explorations into all aspects of the human experience.
We really appreciate you tuning into this AI-powered presentation. Our goal is to push the boundaries of AI in content creation, and your input is invaluable. If there's a particular subject you'd like to see us tackle next, or if you have suggestions on how we could fine-tune our AI's creative prompts, please don't hesitate to leave your ideas in the comments section. We're excited to bring you more unique content very soon.